For our next panel. Dr. Karen Louise Smith from Brock University is going to moderate a panel of presenters, and they're going to talk about digital rights, data governance, policy, and ethics. So I would invite all of them to come up on the stage. So Dr. Jonathan Dewar is going to come back up here. Abby Deshman, and she's with the Director of Criminal Justice Programs with Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and Bianca Wylie, co-founder of Tech Reset Canada and Senior Fellow, Centre for International Governance Innovation. And I think I most recently saw Bianca on TVO. All right, so come on up, folks, and take it away.
Check, check, check.
Okay, it looks like we're live. So thank you so much for bearing with us through the breakdown of the stage, just so that we can see everyone's faces. And thank you to Mary for introducing the panel that I have here. To build on some of the comments from Jonathan earlier during his keynote, and also from what we just heard from Jean-Noué, what I really want to highlight is that we have a group of people on the stage right now who are not afraid to start with issues of justice, and who are not afraid to start with issues of equality within our communities. And I think it's really important that we consider what happens when we start from a rights-oriented perspective, when we start thinking about citizens, communities, and these places that we all reside. When we start from that perspective, our conversation about data might be quite different. So that's the opening provocation that I'd like to offer to everyone who's gathered in the room, but also to our panelists. We know that there's some movement right now away from an open by default paradigm. There are lots of situations where open by default doesn't necessarily work, and where collecting data in the first place might be a very fraught thing. It might not be the right course of action. So we're going to keep these perspectives in mind as we think about this. Many of us are enthusiasts for open data, but it's important to keep in mind alternative perspectives and different kinds of cases and contexts. So since everyone's already been introduced, I'd like to start off with a question for our panel around what we mean by rights. Abby, would you like to tackle this first?
Sure. So it's a broad term, and I'll just talk about it in the context of my work. So as a lawyer at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, when I'm talking about rights, I'm usually talking about constitutional rights. I'm talking about human rights and human rights codes, basically the body of laws that regulates the relationship between people and communities and entities with a lot of power. And certainly, rights in a digital context are part of that larger envelope. For me, instances of interactions between people and entities with power happen online and in the digital context all the time. And we are constantly seeing those new contexts play out, but within this existing framework of the Constitution and human rights.
And let's just go down the line. Jonathan, do you have some thoughts to add here around what we mean by rights?
Sure. Is that on? Can people hear me? Okay. I've taught this as a course, so the next time I encourage you to sign up for that course. It takes 3 months. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to make very brief comments because I've already had a lot of your time this morning. In a 30-minute or less presentation, there are many more things I would have loved to have covered, but knowing that we were going to talk about this on the panel, I think that the point that I would make is, with regard to First Nations, it's also important to understand the idea of rights that are held collectively. So in First Nations contexts, if we think about history from a time immemorial perspective, and again, acknowledging the diversity across First Nations, but from a time immemorial perspective, there were these complex understandings and teachings around what we would say in English are rights, and how communities or collectives can come together and hold things, and then the way individuals exist within that as well. And really that's not something that's well understood in the Canadian context, and certainly our Canadian law does not reflect that.
I'm going to try to say this gently. I don't come from a rights background, so I don't know much about human rights, but I'll share a little story. I don't know, doesn't matter. I was online and I was getting into a discussion about privacy, and someone's tweeted at me that privacy should be a human right. And I was like, yeah, and I retweeted it, and then someone tweeted at me and said, it's been a human right since like 1960 something.
And I'm sitting there going, okay, so how's that working out for us? And I think this is the problem for me with a lot of these institutions and structures of old. I don't think they're working. And I think we need to challenge the fact that we're giving into or, ceding power to institutions and structures that are continuing tons of violence. So I'm kind of looking at where were rights good, but where are rights failing right now? And I don't know enough of the legal history, so I don't mean to dump on something that I don't know that much about. But I don't ascribe a lot of value to the rights regimes that I see when I look at the violence that we live with right now.
Okay, I really appreciate all of those points. To kind of integrate and to think about how we deal with some of these competing paradigms, how we deal with rights paradigms, how we deal with data-focused paradigms. We see things like the General Data Protection Regulation emerging in the EU, and we have cases where new rights are being ascribed to people, and things like the right to keep yourself out of automatic and automated decision-making, kind of algorithmic decision-making that might happen as data is collected. But I think we need to ask whether these are new rights. We know that algorithmic bias, that we might have things like racism embedded in systems, and those discrimination issues that have been a part of our human rights frameworks for a long time. Those are old ideas. They've been around for much longer than 50 and 60 and 75 years, and we need to look at how to reconcile some of these different ways of thinking. So the next question I have for the panel is why the open data community should care about rights, or why they might want to think about rights. Is there someone who'd like to start us off with this question?
Should I start again?
Okay.
So for me, when I think about open data, I think open data is one instance of how I view rights. So open data can and does feed into access to information, democratic accountability, which we absolutely view as part of our panoply of democratic rights that we need as people that live in a democracy that's supposed to be accountable and functional. So that is a core way in which those two terms work together. I think, though, that obviously the term rights is much, much, much broader. And having a fulsome view of what digital rights are, when information and actions in the digital sphere can involve more traditional rights, gives rise to a whole bunch of ethical and legal questions that the open data community needs to grapple with. And a lot of these were talked about in previous presentations, and I learned some great new terms to give expression to some of the problems that I'm seeing in my work. But, very traditional rights like the right to privacy, equality, freedom of expression, anonymity, privacy in public spaces, autonomy, dignity, all of these concepts, the underlying values that animate our rights framework and our Constitution are all going to arise when you start talking about open data, publishing information, and how that impacts individuals and communities. And difficult questions about balancing. So most of the hard cases that we work on are not, they're not clear-cut, right? There are multiple interests, all of which we think are important. And there are frameworks to help us try to think through in what contexts and what instances a certain interest might prevail, and in what other contexts and instances it's going to be subservient to others. So those frameworks, that rights-based framework, limited as it may be, can help us think through and flag some of the other issues that are coming up in this context as well.
Bianca looks like she's ready to chime in.
Yeah, I think to take it back to some of the origins of open data and even technology, I think the open data space is an elite, privileged, very white space. And you go back and take data and technology, and you go back a bit further, and Silicon Valley and technology, it's a white space, predominantly male space. And so this sort of normative place from which a lot of this stuff was born is essentially stewed in white supremacy, which is a problem. So let's just park that one for a second as obviously an issue with how these things intersect, because a lot of that technology is what is either capturing or publishing data. And I think that's not something to take lightly when we think about what openness is. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee, who, I don't know if you've been following, you know, he is someone who has played a big role in the internet existing and is very sad with what's happened to it. And now another old white man is going to be in charge of fixing it, or so he thinks. And I think all of us need to really look at the position we sit in right now and understand, before we go down and even, you know, use tools like data and technology, you know, we have to think back to structural problems. And I think we think maybe we'll use data to solve problems when we have very institutional, large problems that relate to rights. So what I get concerned about with the technology community and the data community is they think that their tool is the tool, and they're ignoring the huge political demands that are the ones that they should be focusing energy on. And I say this as part of this community. I don't say it as someone from outside it.
Okay, Jonathan, would you like to add anything to
Sure.
really why?
I mean, just very briefly again, you know, our Prime Minister, I think, well, in the context of First Nations, our Prime Minister refers to nation relationship. For Inuit, it's Inuit to Crown, and for Métis, it's government to government. So again, from the First Nations perspective, it's the right rhetoric that's being used, the idea of a nation-to-nation relationship. The problem is structurally, it's not enacted that way. There's still the issue of Crown supremacy. I've been a federal public servant, and I know there are several in the room. I know how difficult it is to write a note up to a minister that includes the word First Nations sovereignty, the words First Nations sovereignty. These are things that need to be grappled with, and I might be going off track a little bit here, but just to take this thought to its logical conclusion, I was saying to a colleague on the break, and unfortunately well into Jean Noé's presentation, that because we were having a great conversation at the back of the room, that I mentioned in my presentation the idea of the 101 that needs to be done, so getting people up to speed. And there's a certain responsibility that First Nations, Inuit, Métis feel that they have, but that responsibility stops at a point, and that's the work, the challenge that I gave to you, that work needs to be done, to be done by you. But the bigger challenge is to say to Canada, and that's from the Crown on through the Federation, the provinces and territories, and all the way down to the municipal and local levels, Canada does need to get its house in order and meet us, you know, at a true nation-to-nation table, structurally speaking, but also, you know, spiritually speaking. These are important concepts, and this is work that you have to do on your side of the table. So, a bit of a tangent, but that's where my thoughts went.
Okay, thank you for sharing those thoughts. And I thank our panelists for raising some of these tricky situations and contexts where there's a lot of work to be done, because there are places and spaces where a lot of reflection and a lot of effort needs to be addressed towards dealing with multifaceted issues and challenges. And I want to continue this idea of challenges. A number of you work in contexts, all of you work in contexts that are fraught for various reasons, in terms of how data is used, how it's collected, how it's been shared and published. So I'm wondering if you can share with the people in the room, if they don't necessarily have background knowledge, what is an issue or controversy that you're grappling with in your work, and how does it demonstrate some of the complexities of the rights of various communities?
I can go. Smart cities, just to pick up, I think, on a thread that most of, well, it was around this morning. One of the biggest issues that I'm grappling with right now is the fact that technology, again, to connect this to history, the way that we use technology in our cities is being driven by an economic development mandate. So the excitement, the enthusiasm, the proliferation of what we are very close to instituting a surveillance state in this country because we think it's going to give us a lot of jobs. True. Right? And this is not, to Jean Noé's point, people in Canada like to look at China. People in Canada need to be looking at Canada. And so this idea that this enthusiasm is overtaking the fact that, you know, I think about civil liberties and social norms. I think about the world we live in post 9/11, where fear is dominant. And I have gone to meetings where I was so surprised to hear communities wanting CCTV cameras. that the surveillance is actually being welcomed. And so these issues, I think, get really difficult because what we should be doing is flipping this narrative around and saying, and particularly if we're going to be talking about reconciliation, and I only say talking about because I don't see a lot of doing, but in terms of doing reconciliation, we need to go right back to reorganizing, how we're using technology. Our relationship to land is implicit in technology and smart cities. And so all of these things, it's like really reorganizing the way we're having the conversations, starting with how do we want to live in our cities? Set the guardrails to do that, set those things out, and then you can do economic development. You can't do it the other way around, and the predominant narrative for 20 years has been the other way around. This is hard.
So, and jumping off of that, so my area of work is criminal justice, and obviously one of the core issues that has been, continues to be an issue in policing is racial profiling and race-based decision-making and targeting of communities. And traditionally, policing, proving racial profiling in policing is extremely difficult. So, in past 10, 20, 15 years, you have a police officer on the stand, you have maybe some data about differential policing, but proving racial profiling is hard, and that's when you can get a person in front of you and ask them why they made the decisions they made. So now we're looking into the future, 5, 10, 15, 20 years of policing, and we're seeing predictive policing and algorithms and big data starting to come in, especially in the States, and there's interest here in Canada as well, to inform policing decisions. So what does this look like? This looks like massive databases scraped from public sources, administrative sources, and closed sources. Police databases are not open to the public. This looks like private companies coming in and taking that data, using proprietary algorithms to decide who's a risky person and what's a risky place before crimes happen, and then sending police resources out to address those identified risks. And when you hear about how police who are using this technology describe the way it works, they say it's magic. It just tells me who to target and where to go. And so we are taking a problem that is already endemic and already very hard to tackle, and we are embedding it behind a layer of proprietary technology and data that is not open to the public. And that is going to make things much, much, much harder from an accountability and oversight perspective. And it's not neutral, right? So the data that we're using is data based on decisions made by individuals operating with a racialized lens within this context. It is data based on a policing focus on certain communities that tells us a lot of crime happens in these communities because we've sent a lot of police there, so that's how we know the crime happens. And then that's the basis that we're developing future models of who is a risky person and what are risky places. And then the algorithms themselves, right? So this is a whole layer of technology and data that is going to become very difficult for the traditional institutions to oversee and to query and to get behind for a number of reasons. And in that context, I'll just mention, it's a bit separate, but the notion of communities deciding what data gets collected about them is also central to this particular issue. For many, 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 many years in Toronto, the Black community was very adamant that race-based information not be part of the information that police collect, because they were extremely concerned about how that information would be used. Information is power, how you get that information out, what narrative accompanies it, who controls it. That was police data, and they did not want race-based data to be collected by police, despite the fact that they knew that it would show that their communities were being targeted in differential ways. So when we're talking about, I'm talking about accountability, now we're in a different era where we are collecting and disseminating that data, and, opinions change, but giving autonomy to that community to decide what was important to them and how they wanted that data used was a core part of that debate. And when we move towards collecting by default, publishing by default, we risk taking away some of that autonomy in discussion.
And I think, quite simply, following both of those comments, good governance is central to this. Good governance, not just from a First Nations perspective, but I think from a human perspective, if I can say that, has people at the center. It is inclusive, and it is representative. And so whether it's a city, a municipality, Indigenous people live in cities, whether by design or by circumstance, and the circumstances can be wonderful and they can be tragic. Do Indigenous people see themselves represented in the city? Do they see them represented in the city system, structurally speaking? And of course, Indigenous people are also overrepresented in our federal institutions, correctional institutions, are victims of profiling. And so Indigenous people living in the city or anywhere, I just brought it to people generally. I live in a city. I am certainly interested in knowing how the information that is collected is governed, and is it adequately representative of the people in that community. And a community can be, we can define community in a lot of different ways. A community can be a lot of overlapping communities. And that level of complexity also has to be factored into the way we build governance systems. And again, at the center of it, it's human beings being good human beings, which is hard for us, but there are some good examples of that.
Yeah. And if I can just riff on this quickly, I say to a lot of the people in the room right now talking about algorithmic accountability and ethics and AI in these topics, something I've noticed, quick anecdote, I was in a room with maybe 25 people, very well-intentioned people, mostly white people. White woman says, lawyer, she says, the reason we have to get on top of this is because this is, a lot of the data that was built, she had an American case, was talking about that there was information on criminality of black men, and so it was increasing the profiling of the software. And what people don't realize they do when they say that is they're doing it again, creating an association in that room of black people and criminality. Do you see what I'm saying? Like you're doing it again by that reference in that story. And so I think we also need to be thoughtful about how we talk about these issues, because that, to me, when I hear that, I think, okay, it's true, but how do we talk about this in a way that isn't doubling down on what I'm saying, what's true is the issue, but how do we talk about the issue so that we're not actually just entrenching and accelerating that again, right? Like this is taking back how we think about our words, even when we want to have good intentions, I think is really important right now.
And it's very tough.
Yeah.
It's a difficult thing to do, to have these conversations and to get towards the place that the conversation is moving the community or moving forward.
Yeah, we need to step in it right now. I like my biggest concern with all of us in this room and in this world right now, there's urgency, the earth is burning, there's hate crimes proliferating. Like if it's not, what's the saying? If it's not us, who, and if it's not now, when? Like these things, we need to get messy fast because we're not going to get out of these things in any other way. So I just really hope I step in it all the time. Like just step in it. People will be okay with you if you're trying. And maybe they won't be, and then you're gonna meet new people and you're gonna not make the same mistake.
Okay, so I wanna ask now if there are any particular critiques from your work that emerge from your work that would be useful for government, for members of the CODS community to think of and be aware of. Are there critiques or particular elements that you'd like to highlight?
So I can start. And this is not, a broad critique. This is just my own personal disappointment looking at open data and the way that it's panned out. And it's because I've spent the last 2 years particularly focused on provincial corrections. So provincial corrections, provincial jails have very, very, very little oversight compared to federal institutions, and there's very little data about what is happening in our provincial correctional institutions. And so when I saw the Open Government Directive, the Ontario government, I got pretty excited. Well, now I know there's data sets. Maybe I can actually have access to those data sets and find out who these people are, how long they're there for, and more detailed data than we get at the Stats Can general level. And if you go onto the inventory page that lists all the data sets, corrections has almost no open data sets. And that's not because there isn't corrections data that's aggregated that you could put out there. That's because, and now I have the term for it, open washing, right? So these initiatives operate against cultures of presumptions of what information should be put out there, what information is readily put out there, and unless you actually critique why a area has been historically closed to scrutiny, has been historically shut behind doors that don't allow for accountability and transparency, then this initiative to push information out is not going to open those doors and is not going to allow accountability and transparency into those spaces where it is so desperately needed. And then similarly, data poverty, yes. So my experience in corrections was on the independent review of corrections and then in the minister's office. Never mind pushing data out. We don't even have data about the questions that we need answered. Often in provincial corrections, we're talking about slips of paper that get passed from one person to the other. So without querying who are we looking at, what data is being collected, for what purposes, who's deciding what actually gets out there, and critiquing the underlying structures of power and accountability and deficits in power and accountability, then layering an extra, just pushing data out there is not actually going to get at some of the more fundamental accountability and transparency problems we have.
Take it a little philosophical here, right? Yeah? Good. Okay, I know, you're hungry, you're like, come on. The universality, I think, is a critique that I think a lot about right now in terms of is open somehow have a normative good associated with it. When people say ethics, when people say things like public good, which I say, all of these things, they sound, democracy. I am and was astounded at the turnout of the people who have been running for office, the people who ran in the last municipal elections in Toronto, racialized people running for office that has proven itself such an awful place to be, and still coming out, for democracy. The American election, same thing. The point here is that talking about this universality, I think, is getting us all into trouble, and we need to start to talk about complexity. And I think Jonathan it was so much of that this morning. And I think the way out of some of the issues with open is to get into granular use of things, not just open and throw it out into the world and see what happens, because I think that was a little bit of the starting days of this. Open licensing of data has unleashed huge problems. And so this is a really good time to stop and think about having discussions with everybody to say, okay, we've got this data, who's a stakeholder related to this data, how can that data be used, under what conditions, and bringing it back in and having more granular conversations. Because only then can we get into trade-offs discussions, which is what most of these difficult conversations are. What might be good for someone is bad for someone else, and then we have to make a call about it. But we'll never really get there unless we have more granular conversations. So I think I've really been thinking about that universality piece as a problem, that these things have these assumed good kind of ideas with them.
Yeah, and thank you. I may be repeating myself a little bit by coming back to this point. First Nations, and you'll hear this from leadership, and you'll hear this from people all the way down to the grassroots level. First Nations people are interested in meaningful relationship within Canada, with Canadians, and abroad, internationally. You'll hear many First Nations leaders talk about First Nations, their communities being open for business, and so all of that is good. But none of you in this room expect that you would have access or a right to access the information of another sovereign nation. So again, I come back to this idea that for First Nations, this isn't a new term or a new concept for First Nations. It's not, a few years old. It's not a few decades old. This is a time immemorial concept, nations as sovereign. I think that there are some fundamental and foundational things that we do need to do. So it goes back to that piece about Canada, whatever that means, certainly our relationship with the Crown, needing to get its house in order, to do things systemically and structurally on that side of the table, and I use that analogy for what it's worth, but on that side of the table so that there can be an equal space for First Nations, and to the extent that I can speak for the experience of Inuit and Métis, which is very limited, I do know that we share many things in common in terms of that relationship with the Crown. So it's really that piece that I feel the need to come back to. I'm really thankful for hearing the points from the other panelists. And again, I apologize for being very, very narrow in my focus on First Nations, but that's what you got when you invited me. I think it's the point that does need to be repeated for us, that a rush to openness can have many benefits. For us, there are challenges to that. The fundamental one being, we need you to understand where this relationship is going with Canada, where these nation-to-nation relationships are going. This is not an aspiration. We are forming the bricks and laying the bricks to build institutions to do this work by First Nations, for First Nations, but in partnership with Canada. And we need to know that there is an equal partner on the other side and not, a parent on the other side.
Thank you. I think we're approaching the last question from me. And what I'd like to challenge our panelists to do is to tell me if there's one word or one term, one concept that you would like the people in the room to be aware of. They might not be able to write it in their briefing notes for various reasons, but what term or idea would you like the audience here to be aware of?
Are you looking at me?
Yes.
Yeah. Whoever has their idea first can maybe take the pressure off Bianca here.
Okay, I'm going to repeat the word that I used during my presentation towards the end, and I talked to Elaine about this. I think hopeful. The whole point of First Nations building the kind of institution that I'm representing is so that partnership, relationship can be successful. Keep in mind that this organization was founded and was sustained through what we might refer to as the darker years of the Stephen Harper government. And so there has been proven benefit to these, it's an organization, but we're building towards the institutions necessary to do this work. So it's in that context that I would say that I think we have a right to be hopeful. We will be strident on some of our positions. And again, not speaking directly for First Nations leadership, but they will and have been strident on their positions as they need to be. But I do think that we have reason to be hopeful.
Okay, so I'll have a less hopeful word. And I went through like a bunch of words that I could also say, but probably power is something that often gets obscured through a whole bunch of systems and institutions, and it's everywhere. And it sets up relationships between people and community, and it will flow throughout rooms and decisions, and it will inform how information and data and control and access and purposes, like all of those things are informed by power. And I think if we do nothing else but be very aware of the power dynamics of what people are in what rooms making what decisions and what people are not in what rooms and not making decisions, that will go a long way to flagging issues that we need to be aware of and how to build more inclusive, more equal structures.
And now, do you have a word, Bianca?
I do. I'm going to take Jean-Noé's advice unpicking this word, and I hate half of it, it's a term, but consumer protection. So I'm going to go consumer protection because trying to figure out how we get away from only talking about privacy and start to talk about safety, but talk about safety in the way and in the tradition of civil engineering and standards and the physical infrastructure, the fact that the miracles of science and mathematics that we used to build things, to take those ideas and to take that tradition and bring it into the digital infrastructure of our lives so that when we interact with systems, they're safe, but not surveillance kind of safe. I mean safe in terms of protecting, whether it's mental health, whether it's, it could be privacy, but basically things that take norms and make it so we can have a safe space to leverage and, benefit from technology. Because I don't want us to get scared of it, and I don't want us to lose out on all the wonderful things we can do with it if we think about it that way. So I think Ralph Nader, he was in Ottawa, Ralph Nader, Mr. Seatbelt guy, like we used to not use seatbelts in cars. There's something about the history of consumer protection. The part I don't like about it is the word consumer. So that's the part that I'm like, that's not really the right lens here, but I'm blame Jean away. I think we can talk about consumer protection. I guess the final piece of this is that the opportunity to think about math and science in non-capitalist ways, to think about engineering as math and science, to think about using those things and to get our institutions out of the corporate deadlock they're in right now. Our universities have been really influenced, and nowhere worse than computer science, nowhere worse. Every university has a lot of money coming from technology companies, even the most progressive ones. And we don't have a big, strong, non-capitalist science of computer science. And I think we can do that if we're intentional about it. It's a political decision. We can build up an ecosystem of open source stuff as well. It doesn't have to not be capitalist, but there's a lot to do there. So I think if we start with consumer protection and sort of go there and think about all of these issues in smart cities and others from that lens, we might be getting onto some helpful tracks. And we don't have to start from scratch.
Okay, I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing all of these thoughts. I just want to reiterate the idea that all of us, and I probably shouldn't speak for everyone, but many of us come to open data with some kind of a worldview. And for me, one of the huge takeaways is that we can all pause and reflect what our worldview is, or the worldview of the department or the ministry that we operate in, what that is. You might hear words like the digital economy that really shape and constrain how you may be thinking about data. And hopefully this panel has planted a seed that you can think about things differently. There are other ways to consider these ideas and other worldviews to be brought to the context here. So Yuri is available with a microphone if anyone has a question that you'd like to ask any of your panelists.
Hello, I am from government, and I'd like to think I'm not the enemy. So please, I'm a bit depressed right now. I did like Dr. Jonathan's hopeful word. What do you want us to do? Like, we're working within the system, so we have to believe in the institutions. What you're talking about is very important. I do feel the urgency. What can we do? How can we help all at our levels?
I'm going to make you more depressed.
I'll try to cheer her up afterwards.
Okay, do you want to go first? Okay, good. That's perfect. That's the right combination. Part of the history that I've been learning about that I think is dark and needs to be called out is that the public service used to have more power, and the public service is being politicized. And because of that, we're losing the power that held it in where it was performing well between regime changes, between, political leadership changing. And so when I started in my adventures of open and digital and the rest of it, I was very excited. And when I came to understand that without political action, the bureaucracy is quite constrained. And so to me, like, I know that this, for me, I'm kind of over pretending that the bureaucracy is able to do much. It's basically, thank you for holding down what you've held down, and thank you for doing all the work you're doing in spite of a highly politicized environment. And I think Canadians need to understand that this has been something that happened in the last 20, 30 years. And I mean, I can tell you this institution is nowhere near perfect. I think the public sector, oh, I got one. Public sector unions, you guys are super powerful. What is going on? Where are you showing up in fights for poverty, for racialized people? I think that's a place. That's a place where if you're a unionized person, you have power. There's one latent whack of power sitting in the country right now. It's in the public sector unions. So I think that's a place maybe to do a little more work, and that's not in your daytime work, but that might be in your political capacity to remember how much power you have sitting there, because that's a thing. But I really think this is a political call. I'm going to end on a little Noam Chomsky thing I saw the other day. Honestly, in the last 40 years, the reason we're seeing a lot of the problems we're seeing, according to Noam, and I think Noam's a pretty good guiding light, is because right now, like, it's the first generation in the US, and it's probably here not as badly, but we're stagnant. Like, people's children aren't doing better. And the force that changed in those 40 years is that labor was broken apart. That was it. So our capacity to operate collectively needs to be reimagined, and honestly, in the face of technology, which is highly libertarian, it is challenging. Because what we're getting as tools and digital whatever is actually not generally collective technology either. So that's hard. Okay, now we're gonna get happy, Jonathan? Is that ever a funny, oh man, now looking at you and thinking, okay, you're gonna go with something uplifting from this like setup.
Well, I'll do my best. So my academic background is in studying the colonial context historically and contemporarily, and then studying, notions of healing and reconciliation. So I do a lot of work. This is my day job, talking about this stuff. It's also part of my day job to, infuse my other interests in this work. But I also do a lot of work, particularly with public servants, around, demystifying reconciliation. So if I could go there on that conversation, none of the government people in this room are Indian agents, which was literally a position that used to exist. A racist system created a position for racist views to be held, and so none of you in your government positions are an Indian agent. That's one significant change from the not too distant past. We don't have to go too far into the past to remember that. So when I talk to people about reconciliation, one of the things that I talk to people about is I don't, and this is maybe a difficult message, particularly when you're talking to public servants who, often I'm introduced as part of a panel or as a speaker in the context of an introduction that says, our minister's mandate letter says reconciliation this or reconciliation that, which is a wonderful place to start. And a lot of public servants are eager to do something in the context of their jobs. And so the difficult message that I give them is, I don't want you doing reconciliation work as a job. Go home, do that work at home. You will simply be a better person, not in a position like an Indian agent, but whatever your position, executive director of open data government, yeah. Or whatever it is, analyst, associate deputy minister, whatever that position is, if you've taken that challenge up to think about history, contemporary context, and this notion of reconciliation or conciliation, and you've taken that home to do that work personally, then you will be an effective public servant. You will write those difficult things in notes, and you will rage against the machine that is, a public service that has been politicized. You'll do it appropriately, I hope, and and hopefully the system will protect you from any, evils that may befall you. But I mean, that's really the message. So it's a bit off track for me to go into my personal bugaboo around reconciliation, but it really is to take it home and to do that work. That's the much more important thing. The message for public servants is, if you're doing that at home with your family, with your community, with your faith community, whatever, however communities need to be defined for you, then you'll bring that into work, and it will be, it will create a context that will make your work that much more supportive for all Canadians, But in my case, I'm particularly focused on Indigenous concerns.